When I was a little girl, my favorite book was There's a Monster at the End of This Book, starring lovable, furry old Grover by John Stone. If you don't know the book, here's the basic premise. Lovable, furry old Grover is telling you there's a monster at the end of this book. And he is begging you not to turn the page, lest you get to the end of the book and uncover a monster. His desperate pleas get more and more frantic with every turn of the page, and he escalates, tying the pages down with different materials, ropes, bricks, cement, fearing for his life and yours. As a little girl, the book was scary, but also ultimately not scary, because I knew there wasn't a monster at the end of the book. Grover was scared, and I could feel the energy and the anticipation, and I could exercise a little bit of fear while also feeling safe in the arms of my parents. Now, as an adult, I know that there sometimes are monsters at the end of the book. Sometimes those monsters are in our family. Sometimes they're in our lineage. Sometimes they're in our history or community or country or culture. There are really terrible things in this world. There are the shockingly terrible things of accidents and violence and disease and tragedy. And then there are the everyday terrors of love and loss and aging. Sometimes the terrible is pure happenstance. Other times it's from human error, and in the worst moments, it comes from human cruelty. Today, Indigenous Peoples Sunday recognizes the history of our country is founded on human cruelty. This is a day that shifts from celebrating a man steeped in human cruelty against Indigenous people to honoring Indigenous people. It calls us to tell the truth. Our country's founders engaged in genocide in order to steal land. It was monstrous. And we are all still living in the consequences. Now, our church community today is reeling from a violent accident in which a family that we love was deeply hurt and from which they will be in pain for a long time. Many of you are sitting here today in the midst of your own pains and tragedies, some which have been spoken and some that are just haunting the recesses of your hearts. The world is full of terrible things. To be human and mortal in a world just chock full of human mortals is terrifying. It is a handshake between love and loss, between life and death. This is the reality of the world that we live in. It's not something that we often like to tell our children about, and yet we know it is the world they are living in too. So how do we deal with this reality? How do we live in it? And how do we share the truth of it with our children? When I was doing some incredibly difficult personal growth work, that Grover book kept coming back in my meditations. The framework of that book was both scary and also healing for me, even though there were real monsters in the healing work that I was doing. The comforting message of the book was that the fear of the monster was actually worse than the monster itself. Hiding from the pain, hiding from the truth of the past, hiding from the hard story was doing me more harm and was actually more scary than facing the monster honestly. The frame of the scary comfort of the book was trying to remind me that pain is survivable, even if there's a monster. And actually, facing the monster is better than trying to hide from it. There are people in our country today trying to hide the monsters from our children. Instead of telling the painful truth about our American history, they are banning books and trying to sanitize the ugly parts of our heritage. But when we erase the painful parts of our past or ignore pain in the present moment, we doom ourselves to repeating the mistakes and to suffering longer. The only way to learn from the past and repair the present, and therefore build a better future, is to face it, to learn from what happened, to work to heal the places that are still suffering as a consequence, and then to do it differently. All of that starts from truly knowing our history and facing the pain of it. We cannot repair that of which we are unaware. So if someone asks you what the point is of telling the painful stories, of reading the ugly histories and telling the truth of how now came to be, what is the point of teaching our children about monsters? You can say, so we can understand what has happened, so we can understand our present moment, and in that understanding, start to repair the harm and do better. This is true at a deeply personal level, like in Dawn's story. It's true here in our own congregation and Unitarian Universalism, and it's true in the wider world. We can see the national struggle to reckon with our past reflected in our own lives and faith. In my own family's history, several of my ancestors arrived in the Midwest and bought land during the period just after the Black Hawk Wars, when the Sauk and Fox people were forcibly removed from northern Illinois. The United States government used the 1830 Indian Removal Act to remove Native American people living east of the Mississippi from their land. After the act passed, some Sauk and Fox people moved west of the Mississippi, but others resisted. In 1832, hundreds of Sauk and Fox people were killed for their resistance in the Black Hawk War. My family bought land around the Rock River in Illinois in the mid-19th century and benefited directly from that land theft and violence. That's not part of the story that my family tells. My family tells a story about moving out west to buy cheap, fertile farmland. But our nation's history explains why that farmland was cheap. It was stolen. It was part of the United States government's campaign of genocide against Native people to steal their land. What are your stories? What are your lineages? How are you connected to this history? Every part of our country includes elements of this story because the project of settler colonialism was to steal the land that millions of people were living on and then create a new nation, the United States. Anishinaabe historian Jean O'Brien explains that the physical and material genocide was also accompanied by cultural genocide, erasing Native peoples from history, a process that he calls firsting and lasting. Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz writes in the Indigenous Peoples' History of the United States, quote, "All over the continent, local histories, monuments, and signage narrate the story of the first settlement, the founders, the first school, the first dwelling, first church, as if there had never been occupants who thrived in those places before Euro-Americans. The narrative also tells of last Indians or last tribes, such as the last of the Mohicans or Ishi, the last Indian, and so on. If the end of the book is the genocide of Native people in settler colonialism, then there is a very real, incredibly horrific monster at the end of the book. And if we told the truth about our beginnings, rather than a firsting story about settling unoccupied land, then we might also understand that there's a monster at the beginning of the story of the United States. Our church was founded in 1842, just 12 years after the Indian Removal Act, and 6 years before Wisconsin became the 30th state of the United States. This congregation's origin story is right at the beginning of the Wisconsin State Project of establishing settler colonialism on this land. Our church's founders were part of that project of firsting and lasting here on this land. In her June 13th, 2021 sermon, "The Ground is Troubled," Reverend Dina told you the story of our congregation's first minister, Reverend William Cushing, sent here from Massachusetts with his family. His wife was afraid of Native people, and when a Native American man knocked on her door to ask her for some food, she grabbed her daughter in fear and ran to the neighbor's house. Reverend Cushing and his family moved back east within the year. And that's it. That's the story that we have. That's the story we have about our congregation's relationship with Native people in the early years of First Church. That's the story that we have about what was happening in that relationship just as Milwaukee was becoming a city. It was a settlement of 3,000 on the western frontier of the United States in the first decade after the Indian Removal Act. That's what we've got. The story of this land, though, it goes back further. It goes back to the story of Josette Vieux, the daughter of a Menominee mother and a French-Canadian father who established a trading post here. Josette married Solomon Juneau, and together they built the foundation of what we now know as Milwaukee, which used to be called Solomon Juneau's Trading Post. The story goes back further than that, as Oneida authors Antonio Doxtator and Renee Zahar write in their book, American Indians in Milwaukee. Quote, "Around the time of the American Revolution, Milwaukee was a gathering place, a cluster of 5 relatively autonomous villages of Potawatomi, Menominee, and Ho-Chunk, mixed with significant minorities of Ottawa, Ojibwe, and Sauk. But by the mid-1800s, Indian people were forcibly removed from Milwaukee by federal policy. There is only a monster at the end of this book if that is where the story ends. But it isn't. There is certainly a monster in this book, but the story isn't over. We are still living in the midst of the story right now. And if you are going through your own private nightmare right now, if you're facing a horrifying monster, know that the story isn't over. You're in the middle of it. We, together, are in the middle of the story. Settler colonialism is not the end of a history. And we are not observing a history from the past that's no longer present today. Native American people live in Milwaukee right now. We have members of our congregation who have indigenous lineages. There are Native Americans all over Wisconsin, and here in Milwaukee, there are a number of organizations and activities that serve the well-being of the community. There is no lasting of Native peoples because they are still here and the story is not over. We have to keep telling the history because we want to learn how to be in right relationship in the story we're living today. We want to know what happened before, acknowledge whose land this is, tell the story of how we got here, because we want to be part of repairing harm that has been done. And we want to learn how to do better in the future. Healing does not happen overnight. Healing is a long journey. Repair takes time. It begins with knowing our history. Where are we? Where are you in this narrative? Your personal family history might be different from this congregation's. There are people with Native American lineages in this congregation, African American lineages in this congregation, people with a variety of different lineages that were socialized into whiteness. What is your family's lineage? And what is its relationship with this land? There's also our congregation's history to consider. Who are we together in relationship to this land, and what is our collective role in repairing harm that has been done? Reverend Kimberly shared the story of how our children in religious education have been learning about our history together. They begin with a land acknowledgement, but they don't stop there. And we don't want to stop there either. In your orders of service, there is a QR code. It's on the back page under the title Land Acknowledgement that will take you to a web page of resources Reverend Kimberly and I put together with some help from members. I want to invite you to go to that web page and be part of us continuing to learn together learning as a next leg on our journey. But let's not stop there either. There are resources in that webpage about moving beyond land acknowledgments and moving towards repairing harm that has been done. Things like giving a land tax to Native peoples, something that I've made a commitment to do. But we don't want to stop there either. We want to keep going because real relationship, real repair happens collectively. This is a collective work. It's not something we do as individuals. We have to do it together. And that's where real repair, deep repair happens. In relationship, repair can become transformative. It changes the way we relate to ourselves and to one another, to the world, and to the land itself. Real relationship, doing the deep work of repair, is what helps us know who we are. Understanding our lineages is the beginning point of a journey that has to lead to a recognition of responsibility and then collective movement towards deep, transformative repair and relationship. May it be so, and amen.